now. Okay, that's done. To say that it will be on Cagney's YouTube channel. So we will try and use just first names from the audience. And if I think there is a button you can ask a question anonymously. So yeah, just bear that in mind. And what we would ask you is there is a Q&A separate thing at the bottom of your screen to the normal chat box. So the Q&A is where we'll be taking the questions after all four speakers have spoken. 3 slots with 4 speakers. And the chat box, if you can use that, you know, to if you need to ask if you're having any technical problems, or if you need a link to something that you've heard the speaker speak about, Sally will be monitoring the chat box and doing her best to make a note of any of those kind of questions that aren't questions for the speakers, if you see what I mean. Also, I'm not sure on the webinar function because I've only done a couple of these, but I think you may be able to rename yourself. And if you can, do that. And if not, you could put in the chat box who you are and where you're from. So either by renaming yourself, if you can't do that, and usually that's the little blue, if you hover over your own name, there'll be a 3 little dots on a blue bar. If that's not working, just pop it in the chat box to tell us who you are and where you're from, because obviously you can only see the speakers and the hosts, not each other, which can be a bit impersonal. So that might be a nice way of seeing who's here. Okay, so just from that point of view, also I just wanted to say, last thing is, just in case, you know how things happen with Zoom and technology, if the meeting crashes out or if anything happens like that, please do, we will come back to the meeting, find the link that was in your email and rejoin, and we'll do our best to sort out any technology problems and reopen the meeting. Okay, so if there's anything in the chat box I need to cover that's come in, no. Okay, so I will, without further ado, hand over to our first speaker. Really pleased Tim could make the time to be with us this evening. Tim Johnson is the director of the UK-based Aviation Environment Federation, which I think Friends of the Earth is a member of, a quiet member probably at the moment because we don't have an actual aviation campaigner. Oops. The screen's just gone to large as you've shared your screen, so my notes disappeared. There we go. So the AEF, as it's known, is an NGO campaigning on aviation's impacts for people and the environment. Tim has over 30 years expertise. We're competing here in the aviation and environmental field. He is a lead representative for the environment NGOs at the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization. God, as chair, you do have to pronounce a lot of long acronyms and names, also known as ICAO. And he's a member of the Department for Transport's newly created Jet Zero Council, which I hadn't heard of, so maybe he's going to cover that in his talk. We're hoping that the speakers will be about 10 minutes each, and there should be time for questions, as I said, after all the speakers. One thing I haven't said is that there is a person on the panel whose camera isn't on because she's supporting the 2 people from the West Sussex Youth Cabinet, and Daisy's here in that capacity. Okay, I think if I can hand over to you, Tim, now.
Thanks very much, Brenda, and sorry for being too keen and
no, it's fine. I've got my notes beside the webinar panel, and then because you did that, it took up the whole screen. It's quite funny.
I'm very sorry. Anyway, hopefully I should have waited. So firstly, I mean, thank you for inviting me to come along and say, I think, a few words really. This is such a vast topic, and how we solve it is such a vast topic. It can only be a few words, but hopefully in the discussion after the presentations, we can get into more of the detail and your questions. So I'm really going to talk about how the industry thinks it can make itself sustainable, and in particular some of the sort of technology and sort of alternative fuel ideas that are floating around, and to really try and put that into context. But before I do, I just wanted to start with a sort of review really of where we were in 2019. so Sally, you were quite right in your intro to say, there's less noise and less emissions around at the moment, but the industry is quite confident that it will rebound and probably rebound to 2019 levels in sort of 2 to 3 years time. So there's very good reasons why we don't really want to go back to 2019 from a climate perspective. So just a few numbers really. 4.5 billion passenger journeys by air in 2019. More Britons flew internationally than any other nationality. So that's people that flew on a British passport. More people flew internationally on a British passport than Americans or Chinese or any other nation. And if we were to rank UK aviation, sorry, not UK aviation, global aviation emissions, and treat it as if it were a country, we would find that they were higher than Germany's and just below Japan's. So we would be somewhere about 6, as a sector, it would be about 6 in that global ranking. And that's because in 2019, it emitted just short of 1 gigaton of CO2, which was a record level for the aviation industry globally. But it was also a record level in the UK, where we emitted about 38.5 million tonnes just from UK aviation alone. And I think the other thing to say by way of introduction is this is still very much a fossil fuel dependent industry. And despite all the claims around alternatives to using kerosene, less than 0.05% actually came from those sources in 2019. So it is still very much a fossil fueled industry. And I think there's perhaps one very sort of startling statistic that we need to pick up on as well. And that is, we're talking here about carbon, but if you think aviation's climate impacts are not just about its carbon emissions, if you look up and you see the cirrus contrails in the sky, things you can't see, it's NOx emissions, for example, which alter concentrations in the atmosphere of both ozone and methane. All of these have a warming effect as well. And the startling statistic is actually between 2000 and 2018, aviation's net warming impact, its total net warming impact, was 3 times that associated with its carbon dioxide emissions alone. So yes, it's right to think about net zero carbon, but we have to think also wider about net zero emissions. So the answer to this that we think government will say and has been saying to date, and the industry certainly will say, is we can deal with this. We can change the fuel or we can change the plane. There are technology and sustainable aviation fuels out there that we can transition to. And I wanted just to sort of talk around that just for a few minutes really, and try and explore that a little bit further, because at the moment, you mentioned, Brenda, in your introduction, the Jet Zero Council. The Jet Zero Council is an initiative that Boris Johnson launched during the pandemic to try and make a transatlantic zero carbon flight across the within a generation, basically. No direct timescale, but it's really about zero carbon technologies. And the council's in its early days, and it's very much focusing initially on sustainable aviation fuels. Now, sustainable aviation fuels cover many things. They cover things like the use of biomass. Sorry, let me get back. They cover the use of biomass. They certainly cover things like, if you've seen the sort of waste to liquids debate, but they also cover synthetic fuels. So this is the idea that you can capture carbon from the air with hydrogen and a lot of renewable energy, and I stress a lot of renewable energy, you can convert it into a synthetic fuel. The thing about all these fuels, whether they're synthetic fuels or burning biomass, is when you put them on a plane, the same amount of emissions still come out of the engine. They're not lower carbon fuels in terms of their combustion. They're simply deemed to be lower carbon because in the production process, they've either captured a bit of carbon in the first place or a lot of carbon, or things like biomass have absorbed carbon while they're growing. So in many ways, you could regard them as a source of offset. But this is the thing that the industry thinks it can do now with scale and investment, and some government sponsorship money. These are the things that they hope to be able to scale up in the near term. I think it will happen. The government is very likely in the next month to issue a consultation on actually mandating fuel suppliers to actually offer a fixed percentage of total fuel sales from these sustainable sources. But I would say that, you know, let's not get carried away. The 2025 level is probably going to be around 2%. We may get to 5% by 2030. And even the industry feels that it probably won't get beyond beyond 30%, even by 2050. And that involves a lot of transitioning away from the biomass, which is very controversial, the waste materials, which we want to reduce anyway. So the idea there's going to be a lot of waste around to turn into aviation fuel, I think is a very sort of limited concept. And also, you know, the wider sustainability criteria around land take and land use, and how you can actually support all the infrastructure for these things. So yes, there will be some, we can't get away from that, but certainly not in the quantities where we can envisage, you know, aviation being 100% powered on this by the time we need to be net zero. Changing the plane, you've probably seen electric and hydrogen prototypes in the papers and in social media. Yes, there are planes that fly on hydrogen fuel cells, and there are all electric planes. Currently, these are sort of 6 to 8 seaters. The big challenge is whether you can get batteries big enough or fuel tanks big enough to actually make this like a 100+ seater aircraft that typically fly on most sort of short haul routes. And I think, you know, government, industry and the environment community are probably aligned in thinking that that's not really going to be a realistic prospect much before 2050. Yes, you could probably think about the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the Norwegian fjords, and those sort of short trips with 10 or 15 passengers flying very short distances. We may see that by the 2030s, but we're not really going to see it by 2050s. And I think, you know, despite the sort of ambition, and it's right that we have this ambition, it's very difficult, and in fact, I would say almost impossible to entertain the idea that these will be sufficient to get this sector to net zero. And therefore, when we see government's plan, and we hope to see government's plan very shortly, the government did actually take a landmark decision a month ago, which was to include our international emissions from aviation in the Climate Change Act from the 6th carbon budget, something that we've been asking for over a decade, because we think once you include it in law, you hold the industry to account. You have to face up to the difficult decisions that if technology and fuels aren't delivering all the answers, you need to do something else. And the government is expected to come up with a net zero aviation consultation explaining exactly how it's going to get to net zero in the coming, well, we hope in the coming weeks. I've been saying that since November 2019, and I keep being told it's imminent, but we really think it will be out this side of the summer. And we think this will deal with the other issues, the carbon pricing, the behavioural change aspects, and more importantly, address the thing that probably interests most of you, that there is a recommendation from government's climate advisors, the Climate Change Committee, that there should be no net increase in airport capacity. And the reason they say that is not that they don't think there'll be growth. They think some growth is consistent with net zero aspirations, but not unlimited growth. And we can have a little bit more growth than we have today, maybe about 25% more than we had in 2018. But actually, they've come to the conclusion that the capacity to support that growth already exists in the UK. You don't actually need further airport capacity to deliver that. And actually providing for it may lock us into a cycle that it's very hard to change, and we end up overshooting all our targets. So I think my final point, Brenda, before I hand back, was really to say that for us, most of our work at the moment is very much geared towards tackling those airport capacity expansions. It's likely, that with Gatwick, if the Gatwick proceeds to its development consent order, there will be at least 8 airports that are currently in the planning system seeking airport expansion. And, you know, 2 of these have gone through very recently. Southampton has been given the go-ahead and Stansted has been given the go-ahead. Stansted is being appealed. Southampton may appeal, so then they can't be regarded as final conclusions. But this flies very much in you know, against the recommendation from the CCC that there should be no airport capacity. And if you've seen the news today, there was a report from the Climate Change Committee to Parliament on a progress report for the last year or so, and it was saying in terms of you know, what's worked well, what government's done well, what government departments haven't done well. And one thing they really singled out was the lack of ambition from government to tackle the issue of demand management in aviation. And their thought is that actually we're currently on a trajectory to overshoot by 6.4 million tonnes of carbon by 2030, relative to what the CCC think is necessary to get us to net zero. And if that wasn't worrying enough, our own analysis at AEF suggests that if all these 8 airport expansions go ahead, and if you look at the map, that's Leeds Bradford, it's Bristol, it's Stansted, Luton, Heathrow, Southampton, the freight airport that's proposed for Manston in Kent, and of course Gatwick expansion, then if all of these go ahead, then actually by 2050 we will have overshot that by 9 million tonnes of carbon. Bearing in mind what I said, that the industry currently emits 38 million tonnes, that's a big overshoot. It's not a marginal figure by any means, and it can't just be lost. And you know, we talk about individual airport applications. Each airport says, oh, but our contribution to that is relatively small, so maybe we can expand. We shouldn't think like that. We should think about this in cumulative terms, and we should look at these bigger numbers. So, you know, we would very much echo the no airport expansion. We've worked quite hard this year with all the expansion groups to call for a moratorium for this reason. We hope that airport capacity is one of the issues that the government will have clarity over when its net zero consultation comes out next month, but we'll wait and see. And with that, Brenda, I shall hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. If we were in a normal meeting, we don't do a round of applause. Thank you, and for keeping to time. That's wonderful, really interesting stuff. That's great. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our second speaker, who is Dan, Professor Dan Osborne, Professor of Human Ecology at UCL, that's University College London. And he's also chair of CPRE Sussex, and has interests in how people's well-being is affected by the use of natural resources. And he's a lead author for the second UK Climate Change Risk Assessment Evidence Report, and a contributor to the third West Sussex Youth Cabinet. So I'm going to hand over to Dan for the next 8 to 10 minutes to give us a talk. I can't remember if you've got slides, Dan. You need to come off mute as well.
Mute. Hi. Yeah, I can share a screen.
Before you start, Dan, I'll say that I've got an alarm on for 9 minutes, so you might hear just.
Oh, please, thank you. That's really just about.
Okay, thank you.
That's about the right length of time. Thank you very much. Let me just get that up. There we go. So we should be able to see that now. So I wanted to. Hang on. I wanted to say something. My screen's gone blank. That's better. I wanted to say something this evening to you about what happens, if you like, if carbon emissions don't fall sufficiently. And that's that there will be consequence of that kind of thing. And when we're thinking about particular sectors, of course, those sectors that can decarbonize, that can do things to reduce their emissions, will look good in the investment market of the future. And those sectors that can't do anything to reduce their emissions might not attract, be so attractive to investors in the future. So there are quite a lot of economic levers here that can apply. So where are we heading at the moment, and what kind of progress should we be looking towards? So I'm going to give you a few figures here, and these are very approximate. Please don't take them as being literal. It's my, if you like, easy summary about what kind of pathway the world is on at the moment. Now, for the Paris Agreement, that's the big international agreement that was made a few years ago now, gave the world a target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial global averages. That was the sort of the maximum amount that we wanted to go to. And another take on the Paris Agreement, that it was looking for temperatures well below 2 degrees. Because I think there was a kind of understanding that it would not be very wise to try to live and operate a modern economy and society in a world that was more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And I stress the average there. Now, to meet the terms of the Paris Agreement, that means that emissions must peak in around 2020 to avoid serious social and economic impacts, and then fall really quickly to near zero by mid-century or soon after, or even in some ways of looking at this, you'd have to have negative emissions. So no emissions at all in order to hold the world into a climate comfort zone, if you like. And that's requiring a transition that's equivalent really to a new industrial revolution. So we've got to bring in a lot of new technologies and new approaches to things, and a lot of new behaviours, etc., from individuals and corporations and institutions that really are the equivalent of a new industrial revolution. It means, you know, if you try to take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, pardon me, and put it back underground, you would have to try to reverse the oil and gas industry in a period of 30 to 40 years. So that's the kind of thing that you're asking the world to do. Now, current commitments, newer ones, have made the picture a little bit better. But the current commitments before the new KG7 to reduce some of these emission targets, or to increase the reduction, if you like, suggest a world that's closer to between 3 and 4 degrees centigrade. Pardon me. Now, after the new KG7 meeting, there's a lot of progress in the right direction. United States, China, etc., are making a lot of interesting promises, but they may still leave the world above 2 degrees. So even what we've got on the table at the moment won't necessarily reduce temperatures sufficiently to avoid serious problems. And at present, the global average increase above pre-industrial is already about 1 degree. So we're not that far from 1.5 at the present time. So that kind of stresses the urgency for the COP26 meeting. And these averages are not really, in a certain sense, what matters. You know, that's what gets the headline. What really counts is how hot will it get near you. And you can see from this diagram, you can find lots of these kind of diagrams from the research community. And this shows you that under certain emission scenarios, you can chart the differences in temperatures, and the darker areas on the diagram are the hotter ones. And you can see that the nearer the poles you are, the warmer it gets. And under the latest climate change risk assessment in the southern UK, under the very worst case, then we could see temperatures rise not 2 degrees, but maybe up to 8 degrees during summer periods and things of this kind. And you know, people might say, well, that's really unrealistic. But in actual fact, in summer 2020, I mean, there were several days that were 10 degrees above the long-term average. And there have been temperatures in Oman and places like that recently, where I think there was a day average of about 49 degrees centigrade. And that's really very difficult. If you want to find out more about this kind of thing and how it will affect your local area in the UK, if emissions don't come down sufficiently, now I've put some websites here for you to be able to have a look at some of these things, and they are really quite friendly to people. Lots of summaries and information from media. Go and have a look at some of that stuff, and that will show you what's going on. And are these models working out? Yes, because at both poles we've got those figures from research studies. Temperatures already 3 to 5 higher. And so, what kind of impacts would we have? Emissions get a lot of attention, but of course climate change is kind of already happening, and damaging extreme events are increasingly linked to climate change. That's storms, fires, intense rainfall leads to flooding, heat waves that leads to overheating in a lot of our buildings, and a more likely possibility of drought conditions. And we know how variable our own weather in the UK is at the moment. But then there are also problems not only with extreme events, they get lots of headlines, but more difficult to get into people's minds and to think about are the long-term trends in temperature that lead to effects like sea level rise, loss of sea ice, melting glaciers that provide millions of people in parts of the world with drinking water and water for agriculture, etc. So lots of extreme event problems in terms of a more greater frequency or greater intensity, and these long-term trends that we all have to plan for. So really adapting now is essential, and that adaptation needs to be done at the community level. So we need to start doing this, and I've listed here the kinds of things that people might have to do, might have to travel differently, might have to consume less. But that could mean just simply buying more durable products, and it might mean increasing resilience to floods and droughts. And that's not going to be an easy thing to do, and it will all cost a lot of money. But many of these costs could be avoided. Possibly trillions of dollars are at stake here, in terms of the costs that adaptation would impose on everybody one way or another. So really getting those emissions down is terribly important, and every sector has to play its part in getting its emissions reduced. How the aviation sector will deal with this, I don't know. Possibly we've heard a little bit about some of the new technologies. What happens if COVID causes a permanent change in people's attitudes to travel? Perhaps people will fly less frequently on jollies such as hen parties or stag do's. Maybe they'll have those in the UK, a lot cheaper to do so. So lots of things are in the air at the moment. So we need to really be ready to rethink our views of assets and what gives a company a license to operate, what investment patterns people are interested in future, how do people look at insuring for damages, and how transparent are corporations and institutions about emissions, and how effective could any offsetting scheme be? And is there anyway enough offsetting capacity available? That might not be the case. So that's the kind of sort of thing we've got to think about, knowing full well that there's going to be a very big emphasis, I think, in the future on planetary health, planetary limits, working within the planet's capacity in order to deliver a good level of well-being to us all. If we don't get those emissions down, we're going to put a lot of that at risk and cause ourselves a huge amount of unnecessary expenditure. But thanks very much. That's me finished. So on to the next speaker, perhaps.
Oh,
Brenda?
That was quick. You sure you finished?
Yes, absolutely. That's all I wanted to say for now.
Stop sharing your screen for us.
I'll stop sharing, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. In fact, I was just in the middle of about to post something, and I'll do it in a minute, but I was interested in your green, the new industrial revolution that you mentioned, because Friends of the Earth has done 2 reports this year on green jobs and the need for expansion in that. And one of the reports is particularly highlighting the need for apprenticeships and young people to move into green jobs. I'll post a link about that in a while. Talking of young people, we're going to move on now to 2 representatives from the West Sussex Youth Cabinet. Alex and Katerina are going to give us a short talk. They're 2 environmentally aware young people who are here today to give us a talk about how to tackle climate change. As I mentioned earlier, in case you joined us late, Daisy Watson from the West Sussex Youth Cabinet is also here to support the 2 young people and to help answer questions that come in. I have noticed there's, I was going to say only one question, but somebody else has only 2 questions. So if you want to get your questions in the queue while these speakers are on, do pop them in the Q&A chat, not the chat box, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or if it's on a phone, it might be not at the bottom of your screen. So Alex is going to kick off and then hand over to Katerina. Katerina, do you want to get your slides up, folks, and take it away?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, I am Alex and this is Katerina. We are both members of the West Sussex Youth Cabinet, which is a group of young people who represent and champion the views of young people on both a local and national level. There are 40 members of the Youth Cabinet and a handful of Youth Parliament members. So this means we're able to focus on numerous issues concerning the young people to the highest quality possible. West Sussex has had a Youth Cabinet now for over 40 years and each year getting stronger and stronger. With such large numbers of representation of young people in West Sussex, the Cabinet has become more in tune of its constituents. So we're here to talk to you today about the strand of work which we are so proud of, our environment campaign. Young people across West Sussex voiced that they're most right about protecting our environment. So the West Sussex Youth Cabinet sprang into action. We aim to positively impact our society for the better by influencing people to think about how their actions affect the planet. We did this by organising beach cleanups across West Sussex, including help from the members of the public, highlighting the issue of plastic pollution in our seas and around our coasts. These were due to take place during the summer of 2020, however, due to COVID restrictions, these were delayed, but they will be happening when the time is right. We're also in the process of producing podcasts and resource packs for young people, so we're aiming to make our generation more environmentally friendly and conscious and educated ever before. So I'll hand over to Katerina to talk about the environment and how to stop climate change. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Katerina. One way we want to have a positive impact on the planet is by increasing education in schools about aviation and the consequences it has on our planet. Many people dream of travelling the world, and while it would be an amazing cultural experience, the impacts on our planet are very large. As young people, we are encouraged to discover the world around us, but the price is so high in the effect it will have on our planet. 6.3% of the UK's total carbon footprint is produced by flying. While this seems relatively small, the numbers of flights are rising per year as the cost of flying decreases. If we want to stop and mitigate the effects of climate change, we need to stop filling the world with our carbon emissions, and one way to do this is to stop flying as frequently. In turn, this asks the question, why is this not being taught in schools? Often, it is because the curriculum does not cover this topic, as important as it is. PSHE or citizenship or geography do cover climate change and its impacts, but aviation is rarely talked about in lessons. A quick Google search will give you lots of information, but it can be confusing, especially if you're unfamiliar with aviation terms. The wealth of knowledge, facts, and figures out there can be intimidating to read. Young people want to see change, but it's difficult to begin making that change in the aviation industry when we're not educated on the varying levels of pollution air travel causes. We want to have these conversations, but we need to be properly educated about it in schools and colleges right from the start. It would be great if we could all learn from each other and share ideas to create change in the aviation industry. Now we have a short video on why youth activism is needed.
I believe we should look for a call to action, and once we see the action, hope will inevitably come.
My life, or our lives as human beings, are 100% dependent on nature.
It's crazy how much it affects us, but how much people don't recognize it and realize what it actually is. Human beings are the biggest causes of climate change. But the good thing is there's a solution, and we are part of the solution. There are a number of solutions to climate change, and we don't need to research them. They're already there. A lot of people just think we need to plant trees, but it just doesn't end there. We need to focus on change of mindset, change of mentality. If we are to start, if we are to mitigate the effects of climate change, if we are to end global warming, then we must start young. We must focus on adding curricula that is going to benefit them and the environment.
If we work together as a common family, just one family, in combating and fighting against this climate change and putting in measures, then we're likely to protect our future.
Governments need to definitely increase trial allocations towards areas, sectors, ideas, ideals that are meant to tackle climate change.
We as young people should be included more and should be given a lot of chances to actually articulate our issues with regards to climate change.
We must make sure that everything we do is for climate equity and climate justice.
They need to be aware of all the affairs that are actually happening. So we need to create platforms for them so that they get to be exposed and also understand that they are also partners in driving sustainable development.
Because that's how we'll know we matter. My message to all the children, all the youth, all the adults, all the elderly, even the toddlers is you can be the change. You can be the change the world is looking for right now.
Because at the end of the day, we have a future to protect and we've got an environment to protect as well.
Climate change is an issue. In fact, it's a defining issue, and we're living at a defining moment, and we are the ones who will define how we created this revolution and how we put an end to climate change. My name is Yande Panda, and I'm 15 years old.
That was a short video about how we need to include the youth and the adults and the elderly and all work together to create change. It's important that we empower young people to change mindsets about the way we live, because we are the future generations and we will ultimately see the consequences of climate change. Education is one of the most powerful tools in the world, and we should use it for good to make positive change. From preschool to university, the education and the things we learn shape our lives. Teaching children at a young age to be environmentally friendly can have a massive impact. Learning about the negatives of aviation and changing the way we think about travel will decrease our carbon footprint, so it's vitally important to involve all generations, especially young people. Some people may ask how we can get this taught in schools. One way we could do this would be create assemblies and resources to use in schools. This way, we could reach a huge range of young people, and also lots of different age ranges from primary to sixth form. Another idea suggested by a youth cabinet member would be to include it in our form times and PSHE curriculums, which would be a more detailed, in-depth way of educating people about this issue. We would love to hear some of your ideas as to how we can work with every generation to mitigate the effects of air travel. We all share this planet and should try to protect it any way we can, so working together with any generation will help mitigate the effects of climate change. Youth Cabinet wants to make a positive change through our environment campaign, and we're very passionate about becoming greener and more eco-friendly. Thank you.
Thank you. Have you finished, both of you there? Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to do another round of applause because we haven't got a room where we can. So I'm just going to turn my alarm off because that's going to go off any second, in another minute. So you were very good on timing as well. Thank you to all of our speakers. How thought-provoking were they, those talks? Especially powerful, as always, to hear from young people. That you both did really good job there in sharing your what the Youth Cabinet is and what it's doing, and your challenges for not only yourselves but adults as well. We have got quite a few questions that have come in, so I'm going to read out a couple. I've got a couple for Tim. I think I'll do both of those together. So firstly, let's take from Pravina from Croydon. Can Tim please explain what the increase in carbon levels will be as percentages in 2030 and 2050 if all the airport expansions go ahead as planned? You may not be able to answer these just off the top of your head, but then you may. But then there's another one that says about the role of for biofuels in aviation. Are they actually a sustainable alternative, from Chris? So could you take both of those?
I could, and I'll do them in reverse order. So to Chris's question on sustainable aviation fuels, and in particular on biofuels, yeah, absolutely right to be cautious. There are big sustainability issues around some of the pathways for using biomass. Fortunately, the aviation industry has agreed that it has no interest really in using, crop-based biofuels. So the big issues surrounding, land use and displacing food production, we'll hopefully avoid. There are some marginal issues in the issues. I mean, I think, although industries also said they won't use palm oil residues, that is actually being used by one biofuel producer at the moment. So these are the things that are left over from using palm oil for food and other things, but it still gives it a commercial value. That's something to watch out for. But I think the thing I would say on this, I mentioned that the government is about to launch a consultation on what a mandate level should be for the use of sustainable aviation fuels. We don't think we can answer that question unless the government first defines what is a sustainable aviation fuel, what's eligible, what isn't eligible. We don't want to set a high figure and find that it drives unsustainable production. So the message to government very much is define what you mean by it, what you're going to include in it, and then we can have a conversation about how much you should be using it. And then to Praveen's question about percentages, I don't have the percentages off the top of my head, but this is the main thing to take away. If there's no airport expansion, obviously we need to get the sector from the 38.5 million tonnes it emitted in 2019 down to net zero by 2050. And the Climate Change Committee has set out a pathway, and that pathway by 2030 would have seen aviation emissions reduced to around 33 million tonnes. I think by 2035 it's down to about 30 million tonnes, and it continues on a downward slope. One of the things I showed on the slide was if those airport expansions happen, rather than those emissions reducing from 38.5 down to 33, they would have increased by a further 6 million tonnes. So they would be around the sort of, over 40 million tonnes. So I can't do the percentages off the top of my head, but hopefully that gives you an idea. And then just to finish, Brenda, to allow time for other questions, one thing that even the Climate Change Committee does not envisage is that aviation will be able to get to net zero by itself. At best, it thinks it will still be emitting 23 million tonnes of carbon by 2050. And that will have to be balanced by some way, whether that's through carbon removals in other areas of the economy. That balance will be needed. So you could ask yourself the question that rather than being pessimistic, the CCC's analysis is actually very optimistic in many ways about what technology may be capable of delivering. And we may need a much more cautious approach than even limiting demand to 25% increase. We may really seriously have to be thinking about less aviation demand than we had in 2019.
Thank you very much, Tim. Hopefully that's answered the questions as best we can. I think that's quite a thorough reply there, putting you on the spot. I've got a question from Louise Downey. What would Katrina and Alex recommend as the best ways to engage young people of different ages in taking action on climate change? I think Katerina's talk gave a little bit of thought on ways in which the education system could raise awareness, but is there anything else that either of you want to come back on for that question?
Yeah, so we just need to get talking about it, talk to all people of all ages, because climate change can sometimes be quite scary because it is going to have world changing effects, but we need to be positive and think that we can change and we will change, and just encouraging young children to recycle, to think greener, just anything you can really to help get our carbon emissions down to zero.
And also to add on to that, I think speak about it is amazing way, but doing actions is better. So
yeah,
definitely more teaching children and setting schemes up for not taking car journeys unnecessary, getting them out walking in the fresh air, cycling to school and stuff like that. That will make a massive difference. Just short trips, everything makes a difference.
That's great. Does any of the other panelists got any ideas on that one in terms of engaging young people? Just, I know it was to the two young people. Oh, Daisy, did you want to come in?
Just to kind of add to that, on top of the two brilliant answers, actually, is that kind of going off what's already been said in the chat, the Youth Cabinet are hoping to do a event with you guys as well in November, where we'll cover a lot of that. So I would really encourage people who are here, especially the speakers who are here, who have educated us all on so many brilliant things, but also I'm sure a lot of the attendees who have a lot to add, to come to that talk as well in November, a bit down the line, so that we can offer a much more in-depth answer to exactly how we are planning, not just in West Sussex, but hopefully nationally, with other youth cabinets, to start tackling that climate change, that aviation education in schools. So just kind of a bit of a shout out to November, and hopefully you'll get the details sent over.
Great, thank you. Anybody else wants to say anything on that question? Otherwise I'll move on. No. Yeah, it's great to have a mix of ages at this meeting. It's very rare to have that and have young people and contributing, so really appreciate that. I'm going to try and take aviation direct related questions first, and then if we have time go to some of the others that maybe aren't quite so directly about aviation. I've got one from Simon who's saying, has aviation, I think maybe means the aviation industry, oops, it's just jumped because somebody added a question, started bidding for a share of the carbon budget? I don't know if that's a clear enough question, but does Dan or Tim want to? I'm not sure what that means. Tim, go for it.
I think that Dan's speaking, so Dan
Oh,
wants to
Dan,
go first.
Dan, you're on mute. Sorry, I hadn't realised.
Sorry, Tim. I just quickly, the general idea, I think, there of a carbon market and bidding for it is to try and use that market mechanism of auctioning, so that you can get a resource that which will be within the envelope, the acceptable envelope. So effectively, a sector on that kind of process could pay a price that might be above the average value to carbon in order to be allowed to emit it. Those kind of market-based schemes for dealing with emissions can work, but they don't necessarily always work. And in a sense, trading can happen between people who hold parts of the carbon budget, then subsequently, so they start selling things to one another. So it's very difficult to devise an appropriate scheme, but those things can be done. But I'm not sure we're in that position quite yet. But Tim probably knows more than I do about this.
Thanks, Dan. I was going to say something just a little bit wider, I think, and the other way of interpreting this question is that in order to get to net zero by 2050, the UK has a set of 5-year carbon budgets. And when I said that it was a really significant step this year, that government had said by the 6th carbon budget, which is the one that runs from 2033 to 2037, in that 6th carbon budget, international aviation emissions would be included. Then one way of interpreting this question is to say, you know, what proportion of that budget will aviation have? I mean, the CCC has a view, and it sets it out very clearly, but government doesn't have to follow that advice. And is the industry bidding to have more than that and to put the pressure on other sectors to do more in order to compensate for its growth? Certainly its ambitions are higher than the CCC's. I think we can say that. I don't think we've seen any evidence of lobbying at the moment, but certainly its ambitions are higher. So when the CCC says you can only have a 25% growth in passenger numbers by 2050, the industry thinks it can get to net zero and have a 70% growth in passenger numbers. So obviously it will be bidding, I think, very hard to ensure that it has the ability to continue to meet growth as far as practical. And I think that's what we're up against, and that's partly what's fueling the airport expansions around the country.
Okay, I'm aware of the time because we're supposed to finish by 8 and we need to just do a few minutes wrap up. So I'll see if I can take maybe one, possibly 2 more if people are really brief. I have a question from Anne who says, which it sounds like it's not connected, but I think it is, because it's about if we're not flying in so many products. I think that's where she's coming from. So it says we will have to buy more durable products. I have no argument with this, but I do wonder what the consequences of this would be in terms of jobs and individual prosperity. I would be, as I'm going to take chair's privilege here, and just would remind you that I did put in the chat box a link to green jobs reports that Friends of the Earth has have put out this year, and I would say actually it could, you know, we could be doing better with the jobs that we are offering, especially our young people, and we can prosper and have a low carbon future as well. And in fact, it's costing us a lot to have high carbon at the moment in terms of the economy and jobs. But so I wondered, Dan, if that was something, because you covered like the new industrial revolution, if there's anything in there about how that, you know, having longer lasting products might impact. Come off mute, please. You're on mute.
Trying to come off, it's off. Yes, I could understand the concern for jobs and employment prospects and things like that. I think if we headed for a new kind of economy where we were using less resources, that would still mean, I think, that the employment levels could stay perfectly high, because you would use those skilled people who've been producing perhaps less durable products. They would become involved perhaps in the maintenance of or repair that would become necessary for those products that overall were much more durable. What we want to get to is a more circular economy, and one which creates less waste. So there are employment opportunities all the way around that. Employment doesn't have to be about producing goods, new goods for consumption.
Great. Okay. I think, Sally, I'm just going to check in with you. We are nearly at 8 o'clock. I'm sorry to the people whose questions we didn't get to, but there were a couple. Tim or Dan or anyone of the panelists, you can actually type an answer if you can get into the Q&A box. There is a couple of extra ones if you want to. You just click on the type answer and not the answer live if you open it up, the Q&A. And if you've got time to do that while we wrap up, we'll see if we can answer a few more of the questions that I didn't manage to get to. Sorry, because there were about 10 or 12 questions that came in the end, I think. But we've got through about half a dozen, which is not bad for an hour-long meeting. I hope people have found it stimulating and interesting. I just want to say that, I mean, some of the memorable things is that for me with the new industrial revolution, you know, the figures that Tim were giving, and I'm never one to remember big figures, but the 8 expansions, it's not just Gatwick, it's these other regional airports. And in fact, I have been helping Southampton Friends of the Earth with their campaign against the runway extension there, which was really disappointing when their Eastleigh Council approved that earlier this year. That came to mind. I think one of the things, I think it was Katerina that said, young people want to see change and want to see conversations and learning from each other and to be part of that change, which I thought was really powerful to say. I think older people want that too. So it's good we're all on the same page. It's just about making it happen. I thought the video was enormously powerful, so thank you for sharing that. That was a really good idea to have that. And I think it's given us lots of food for thought. Let's get that one out at the end of a long day. So yeah, that's my kind of closing remarks. I think there were some really good points, and I'm really glad we are recording it. I've got my fingers crossed that it does come out on the computer and I'll be able to transfer it to Sally to put on the CAGNY YouTube channel. Because there's bits that I miss, and it was so rich, that the talks were so rich that I would actually like to go and listen to them again, because it's really hard to take in and absorb some of the figures and the information. Really inspiring and very different talks. So well done to Sally and CAGNY's committee for setting up this series of talks, and for choosing some really inspiring and interesting different perspectives on this issue around the aviation sector and what we can do about it. I'm going to hand back to Sally to round up now.
Okay, thank you ever so, Brenda, and for all our wonderful speakers, very thought-provoking. And I hope everyone will go away today and actually join up to the Cagney campaign to oppose Gatwick 2. Cagney is very opposed to all runway expansion for the very reasons our speakers have highlighted this evening. The series of time is ticking talks continues in September. Obviously we have a break, continues in September and runs to the end of November. So the next one is Our Natural World, followed by October, The Air That We Breathe, followed by Concerns for Future Generations, and that's when the West Sussex Youth Cabinet hosts theirs, and that is now the 11th of November, because we're delighted to say Caroline Lucas, MP, has confirmed she is attending. So I know there's lots of smiley faces at the West Sussex Youth Cabinet now, but please note the date has changed from the 3rd of November to the 11th. And then we finish with another thought-provoking one, Alternative to Flying for Pleasure. So thank you ever so everyone for attending. Hope you will be attending future. Please go to our website, which is cagney.org, make donations through cagney.org. Gatwick will be going to public consultation September, October. Most of it will be virtual and online, with a few roaming vans apparently. And the consultation results will go to the section, or the planning inspectorate, and then to the Secretary of State, and we expect that early in 2022. Once the second runway is built at Gatwick Airport, and it's not there currently, the emergency runway is too close to the main runway. It would have to be moved by 12 metres. So they are effectively building a new runway with lots of new taxiways, covering lots of more green space with huge amounts of flood defences. It can be expanded. So the figures I announced at the beginning of this meeting could be expanded upon, because once they've got a second runway, there's nothing to stop them to go back and get new capacity if they would ever need it. But we'll have to wait and see on that one. So thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, Brenda, for being our chair this evening, and good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.